You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Phillips O'Brien. Now, he's written a book which explains World War II strategic thinking in a way that is new to me. We all read about World War II, so we all think there's not much to learn, but that certainly wasn't the case here. Professor O'Brien is an American historian and professor of strategic studies at the University of St. Andrews. He's written several books, including a biography about Admiral William D. Leahy, who is a brilliant, not shadowy, but certainly not showy figure in World War II. As a matter of fact, William D. Leahy, Admiral Leahy, outranks every single airman, soldier, sailor you've ever heard of in World War II. He was the first person, I believe in December of 1944, to receive a 5th star. And after him came George Marshall, and then they went down the list. Let me see if I can get it right. Professor, grade me here. It was Leahy, then it was Marshall, then it was King, then it was MacArthur, then it was Nimitz, then it was Eisenhower, then it was Henry Arnold, then it was Halsey, and then eventually Bradley.
Was Arnold that far down?
Hap Arnold, yeah.
I thought Army, Navy, Army, Navy, Army, Navy. So I think it was definitely Leahy, Marshall, King, MacArthur,
Nimitz,
and then it went to Arnold. Yeah, I should know that off the top of my head.
I didn't. For some reason, I find that whole thing fascinating, and the fact
that it was important because it meant who saluted who.
That's correct. And
so Leahy only would salute the president.
That's right.
That's the only person that Leahy would ever salute.
I guess the only other thing would be if he came into a Medal of Honor recipient and had to click his heels. Yeah. But we're still a little sore about that whole thing, Professor O'Brien, because our Indianapolis native, graduate of Indianapolis Public Schools, Raymond Spruance, should have gotten the 5th star as well.
Mm-hmm. I agree, actually. It was interesting that he doesn't get it. But...
And our Senator, Richard Lugar, who passed a few years ago, worked hard to get him that 5th star, and it just never happened. Professor O'Brien wrote a new book. It was out on August 27th here in the United States. It's called The Strategists: Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt, Mussolini, and Hitler. How war made them and how they made war. Professor O'Brien, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Robert.
I want to make sure that when we talk about all these people, I'm gonna bury the lead just a little bit, because I want to ensure that we talk about Mussolini first, and we may just leave him alone. But you do a deep dive into him like you do on the others. He's obviously the least strong. He's the Chiang Kai-shek of the European theater. But he doesn't start out that way. As a matter of fact, he starts out as a real player. Who was Mussolini, and why is he the first of the 5 to come to prominence?
If you're actually looking at Europe in January 1939, or even you might say in July 1939, you would see Mussolini as one of the great figures of the time. You remember, he had been in power in Italy now for well over 15 years, for 17 years. He had been credited for making Italy into a serious power. Italy had been a state that had expanded its empire. It had fought on the side of the Spanish nationalists successfully, Franco. So Italy was seen as a serious player in European politics, by the way, trusted by not just Hitler, but also by the British and the French as someone who they would take very seriously. And that would be Mussolini at really the high point in 1939. He really was seen as a significant figure. And it's how he got there that was, and by the way, how he blows it, which is also the fascinating situation to be. Because what Mussolini had done is he had done this by not ever going to full-scale war against another power. Now, that was interesting. If you go back and look at his situation, he is a First World War soldier. And he actually serves in the first part of the war. He has quite safe postings, but then he has a pretty nasty posting later on in the war. So he sees what the war is like. What he believes is that Italy needs to be a great power. It needs to see itself as a great power, and it fails to do that in the First World War. What he sees coming out of the First World War is mostly Italian failure. He wanted Italy to be considered an equal of Britain and France and the United States. It was an ally. It was often considered the Big Four. But yet when it comes to the peace negotiations at the end of the First World War, in his mind and others, Italy doesn't do very well. It flubs the opportunity that the First World War gives it. So I was interested in going back and looking at his First World War experiences, and they're quite fascinating. That actually, in 1914, when the war breaks out, you would call him a left-wing socialist. Really, you would say that Mussolini, he's anti-war very early on, August 1914, on the left, writing a socialist newspaper. And you wouldn't call him a long-haired lefty because he has no hair. But you would say he was on the left. But then he goes on this extraordinary transformation. And he becomes a nationalist, a hardcore nationalist, in really a case of a number of months. From the beginning of 1914 to the end of 1914, he transitions really quite dramatically and then becomes very pro-war. And he believes that Italy must go to war to establish itself and to be taken seriously as a power. And so he's one of those pushing Italy into war. So when Italy joins the war in 1915, Mussolini is excited. This is a great thing, according to Mussolini. And he actually signs up and he goes and fights at the front. Now, his front experiences, as I said, are mixed, partly because he might have been being protected. He has some very safe postings and some very harsh ones. He suffers depression at one point, though he doesn't like to talk about that later. But then he comes out of the war, as I said, saying this is a lost opportunity. So when he becomes dictator, when he rises to power, what he is desperate to do is have Italy be taken seriously amongst European states as a great power. And until 1939, he's extremely successful at that. He really builds up Italy in people's minds more than in reality as a great power. That Mussolini believes almost if you act like a great power and you have the will to be a great power, you'll be taken seriously. And that's a key part to his success. Then in 1939, however, he's confronted with a reality that he can't fully bluff his way through. And that reality is that Hitler, who is at that point his closest ally, tells them, look, I'm going to invade Poland. He tells Mussolini in August 1939, I'm going to invade Poland and unleash a larger European war. I don't know what the British and French are going to do. I don't know how it's all going to work out. And Mussolini at that point, very interestingly, makes the right choice. And he makes the right choice by not going to war. He actually disappoints Hitler. Hitler himself has a real crisis when he gets the note from Mussolini, which says, I'm not going to join you, Adolf. Buddy Adolf, I hate to let you down, but I'm not going to join you in the war. Or he says, I can only join you if you basically give me all your military equipment. Hitler can't do that. So he sets impossible demands. And that's actually the right choice. So Mussolini stays out of the war to begin with. But he just can't hold himself to that policy. And when Hitler invades France and starts doing well in May 1940, Mussolini says, I just can't stay out of this war. I can't. I need to be great. And so he throws in and joins the war at that time.
Hitler admired Mussolini as in his earlier part of his career.
Yeah, basically, Hitler really, you might want to say Mussolini is one of the few people Hitler's ever loyal to in Hitler's career. Hitler usually sees most people as pretty dispensable. He kills one of his old friends, Ernst Röhm, who was in his ride to power. He doesn't. He can move on from people very easily in terms of politics. But Mussolini, he remains loyal to, even when he realizes Italy isn't that powerful. So he actually thinks Italy will matter in the war. And Hitler is that's why he's so upset when Mussolini doesn't join the war in August of 1939. When Italy does join the war and it performs very poorly, Hitler really starts understanding the Italian strength is not what he thought it would be. Really, Italian performance in the war is patchy at best. From the moment they go in, from the moment they invade France in June 1940, it's a catastrophe. Then a few months later, they invade Greece, and that's a catastrophe. I mean, it really is a series of poor performances by the Italians. So Hitler becomes, I think, rather skeptical of the value of Italy as an ally. But when it comes to Mussolini, he becomes devoted to keeping Mussolini in power. And when Mussolini is overthrown by his own people in 1943, Hitler goes to great lengths to get him out and put him back into power. So I think Hitler does have a certain devotion to Mussolini the man, which he does not have towards Italy.
There are four other people I wanted to talk about Mussolini only because he'd be so easy to gloss over. And we'll get back to him maybe at the end of the podcast. He has one of the most horrible ends of them all, probably the most horrible end of them all. The other people in your book
couldn't happen to a nicer guy, Rob.
Yeah, but his mistress, she didn't deserve that. Hitler, Stalin, Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. How did World War I, and I know that's a big question, and I know you can skip through it, but how did World War I affect all of them? Because some of them were bureaucrats, and that's not an insult, but they had some real bravery there.
I mean, the two that fought on the front were Hitler and Churchill. And they both had serious moments at the front. And I would say for both of them, it's a formative experience. Which one I can talk about? Which one would you like me to go through first? Are you more interested in Hitler or Churchill?
We got Mussolini. Let's get his BFF, his best friend, Hitler. Because Hitler's views on World War II and how he conducted it were so influenced by World War I, as were, of course, Churchill's and his general staff, who had been through the Somme and been through Passchendaele. But Hitler, how did his experience in World War I affect him as a military dictator years later?
Basically, the First World War makes him. That Hitler in July of 1940 is as close to a nobody as a nobody can be in the world. He's a struggling artist in Munich. He's not making a lot of money. He's surviving on the fringes. He's the kind of guy you would think if you came across him, you would say, this is a crank. This is an absolute nobody. And that's Hitler in July 1914. The war breaks out. He volunteers, but he is an intense German nationalist. So you might say he's one of these people raving in the corner about conspiracies and all of that. If there was Twitter, Hitler probably would have been on Twitter.
I always thought he always reminded me of Gavrilo Princip in his way, just a loner, loser, nobody drifter. And then all of a sudden his moment in history just comes right in front of him.
Yeah, at least Princip at least was part of a slightly larger group. Hitler had nobody. Hitler wasn't part of a group. But he then enlists in a Bavarian regiment as soon as the war starts. And it's not a distinguished Bavarian regiment. It's actually quite a pretty mediocre Bavarian regiment, which partly keeps him alive in the war because that regiment is very rarely sent to the worst part of the line. It's not considered a terribly combat effective regiment, but it is on the Western Front. So he spends the entire war on the Western Front in the trenches, or actually for most of the war as a runner, which means his job is to take messages from headquarters to the front line and back, which is it's a dangerous job. It's a bit better than being at the front all the time because you could spend part of your time in the rear. But he sees the war from the soldier's perspective. So I think that's his war. He is the lowest ranking of all the Second World War leaders in the First World War. He starts as a private and he becomes a corporal. Yeah, that's as high as he ranks. And so his experience of war is often that of the soldier. He's very interested he's a big believer in heavy artillery. Why? Because he believes the side that has the heaviest artillery wins first war battles. There's nothing you can do against heavy artillery if you're in the trenches, if there's a direct hit. And then one time, I think he's wounded, or he's wounded a few times, but in terms of getting hit by a shell as opposed to gas, it's because there's a shell explosion and it gets through the bunker door and hits him in the ass. So he does personally see the value of heavy artillery. So he tends to see firepower as key. That is really his fundamental understanding of war. That does translate very much into the Second World War, because his default position on any military question is we need the biggest guns. Give me the biggest guns, the heaviest tanks, the biggest battleships even. I want the biggest firepower because that was my experience of war. I think it actually has a real weakening impact on Germany in the Second World War, but that comes from his experiences.
He also liked exotic weapons. And they spent billions and billions of Reichsmarks on weapons. I've read Victor Davis Hanson's book, The Second World Wars. He discusses that quite a bit. Like, they spent all this money on stuff that if they had just built more Panzers or whatever else, they would have been in much better shape. Is that fair?
Well, the most expensive German weapon system of the war, the two most expensive in terms of development, actually make almost no difference. They are the V2 bomb, the V2 rocket, not the V2 bomber. The V2 rocket is hugely expensive. In German terms, it basically costs as much as the Manhattan Project cost the U.S. That's that kind of program to develop this rocket. And whatever you think about it, they don't get anything like that kind of return from it. They are able to hit some British targets, but it doesn't make any difference in terms of changing the trajectory of the war. He loves the V2 rocket, so that's the kind of thing. The other things that he loves, that he invests a lot in, he wants a heavy bomber, which would be a 4-engine bomber. So the Germans invest huge amounts in the Heinkel 177, which is basically probably the worst aircraft of the Second World War. You don't know about it because it was so bad. It never really gets effective in flying because of the way it's designed, but it's brutally expensive. He likes things like he wants the first jet planes to be dive bombers, which is a bit barking mad. So he does tend to have this faith, I would say, in German technology. That's another thing that comes out of the First World War, is he ultimately views if you have Allied equipment or German equipment is better. He believes it is technologically superior. So the key thing is that Germany should always develop better weapon systems than the Allies, but he gets the investment plots completely wrong.
Winston Churchill, you mentioned, is the other one who fought on the lines, actually went there after he had some political humiliation related to Gallipoli, but he had served, I think, was that his fifth? Was the Western Front his fourth or fifth combat tour, if you go back to the late 19th
it depends
century?
whether you consider something like going to Cuba with the Spanish as a correspondent and seeing war and experience of combat. Churchill has a very detailed combat history. He first he's in the army right away. He goes and becomes a cavalry officer right out of school. So he never goes to university. He becomes a cavalry officer, and he goes to war instantly as soon as he can, which starts in India. He fights in a counterinsurgency campaign in India. He also fights in the Sudan. When Kitchener does his invasion of the Sudan and the seizing of Khartoum, he fights in the Boer War. So those are 3 actual military campaigns he fights. He sees the Spanish war against Cuba, or to hold on to Cuba. He goes as a war correspondent. So by the time the First World War breaks out, Churchill has had more experience of war than anyone else by a long way. He was actually one of the most probably experienced people of war existing in any government in Europe at that time. The thing that he still had before the First World War, however, I would say is quite a boyish understanding of war. The wars he fought were imperial wars, that they were the kinds of wars where he really believed in being brave and taking risks and being daring and all these things that that you would say a boy had a view of war. And he had quite a dramatic experiences himself from the fighting in Khartoum, from the Boer War where he escapes from a prisoner camp. But I would say he has a bit of a juvenile view of war through the Boer War. It's the First World War where he grows up and becomes a mature strategist. And that's because the First World War forces him to come face to face with real industrial warfare, modern industrial warfare where people get killed relentlessly. You're not just an occasional charge at Khartoum or a counterinsurgency fight in India where you just see this relentless death toll. And he ends up on the Western Front, as you're saying, partly out of political, not partly, entirely because he has a political catastrophe. That he goes into the First World War as a leading politician. He is the First Lord of the Admiralty. So he is the senior civilian in charge of the British fleet. Really important for Britain. This is a very serious role. I mean, if you are First Lord of the Admiralty, Britain relies on sea power. This is a big job. But he ends up destroying his reputation because he pushes the Gallipoli operation. He pushes the Dardanelles operation in 1915. That goes off the rails. It's seen as a real catastrophe, that Churchill is responsible for it. So he loses a lot of his political power in 1915. And that's just what happens to him. So to give him a chance to regain his position and regain his standing, he leaves the government, though he stays as an MP. It's fascinating. He's at the front as an MP. So that's a member. Remember, it's like a member of Congress going to fight in Afghanistan of the United States or something like that. He stays as a member of Parliament, but he says, "Okay, I'm going to go to the front and fight." And he goes to the front, and he's given a unit, and he's given a regiment, and he's going to fight and as an officer on the First World War. And he's at the front from about December 1915, and I think it's basically May, June 1916. On one hand, he's incredibly lucky because he goes, and this isn't deliberate, he just gets lucky. He goes between two big battles. So he doesn't see a big battle. He comes right after the Battle of Loos, and he leaves right before the Battle of the Somme, which starts in July 1916. So he's in this sort of period. And people would say, oh, it's a quiet period on the front. And it was relatively quiet compared to later. But what he sees is just constant, regular, low-level death. A soldier today, two soldiers tomorrow, a dugout hit by a shell the next day. And he goes, this is catastrophe. We are just getting bled slowly to death. That this is the kind of war that is a horrible thing for Britain. By the way, Britain has the smallest population of the great power. It's smaller than Germany, smaller than Russia, smaller than the United States. So he sees Britain as having a smaller population. Yes, there's the empire, but Britain itself is smaller. And he just believes we can't suffer these kind of casualties. This is not anything that we should be doing. And it's being on the Western Front and seeing this relentless daily toll of death that I think makes him grow up as a strategist and makes him step away from pageantry and risk-taking and doing daring, boyish things to, okay, if we go to war, we need to fight this war really intelligently through machines and keep casualties as low as possible and avoid risk. And that actually influences a lot of his decisions in the Second World War.
Stalin and Roosevelt are the final two. I guess I couldn't have chosen, or you couldn't have chosen two more. We couldn't have chosen two more people to end the quick look through about. But one thing I want to ask about Churchill, I always got the sense that his experience, his views, in World War I, in the Great War, so informed his reluctance for the cross-channel invasion of France, which eventually took place in June of 1944. It's pretty clear in your book, and basically in every book anybody ever reads about World War II and that particular instance, that battle, that fight, that Churchill and his staff just simply were petrified of a replay of World War I because they had seen it.
Churchill, even more than his staff, it's Churchill. So Churchill is, throughout the war, the thing that probably causes him the greatest crisis is his constant attempt to keep D-Day, what we call D-Day, from happening. That he really just doesn't want to do it. He doesn't want to fight the German army in France. He believes that will end up being like the First World War, and Britain can't suffer these kind of casualties. So what he wants to do is basically fight in the Mediterranean, where he believes you can keep casualties down, use air and sea power over Germany, and let the Russians fight the big army. So the British don't have to have this big army going into Europe, which would suffer mass casualties.
And that was in contradiction to the United States.
In that fight until May of 1943. So actually the Casablanca Conference, Churchill is able to delay D-Day for at least until 44, and he's hoping permanently. Churchill's hoping never to do it. But from May 1943 onwards, he's basically bludgeoned by Roosevelt into accepting D-Day. That we're going to have to do this. Roosevelt doesn't want to do it in 43. Marshall does talk about wanting to invade France in 43. Roosevelt really doesn't want to do it, has no interest in it. But Roosevelt believes in 1944, the United States is going to have to invade France, that it's the quickest way to win the war at that point. It would signal to the Soviet Union that they're taking their full share in the ground war. Churchill wants none of it. And he fights throughout 1943 and even into 1944 to try to stop D-Day. He really fights to the end, but he's basically crushed by Roosevelt and Stalin, who are going to force him to do that, and he can't get out of it.
That's a great point, that he was crushed by both of them.
Yep.
And the American doctrine was the road to Germany's defeat goes through France. So at the very beginning, right after Pearl Harbor, that's when the Americans and George Marshall and the command can't wait to get to an opportunity to invade. I mean, that's what they want to do. And it's interesting that you say that Churchill basically he's bludgeoning it to their, and the fact that there's a great book of The Devils Will Get No Rest. It's about the Casablanca Conference. I don't know if you read that. It's by James Conroy, and he came on the podcast, and he says one of the things about the Casablanca Conference that was acknowledged by all parties is by then the United States was the senior partner and was
because they could see the production. By early 1943, they can see the production that's going on. But in early 1943, the United States is not unified in grand strategy terms. There isn't a U.S. grand strategy on Europe. That Marshall and the army is interested in doing an invasion in 43. King, bless him, really doesn't care that much about Europe. He wants to send as much as he possibly can to the Pacific. And Roosevelt is hedging his bets, and he also doesn't want to invade France in 43. So the U.S. and Leahy doesn't either. Leahy's dead set against it. So basically, most of the American decision-making structure is actually against an invasion of France in 43, but they do understand there will have to be an invasion in 44. That's where most of them, except the army, are coalescing about. But that's why they performed very poorly at Casablanca, is that the U.S. doesn't have a unified negotiating position. And the British do. And the British position is no invasion of France in 43. Let's do as much as we can in the Mediterranean. And Churchill's view is if you get stuff in the Mediterranean in 43, you will hopefully turn this into the primary theater of war for that point onwards. Let's get into Italy, and then we'll turn that into the area. So Casablanca is, in many ways, I would say, the last great Churchill success of the war. He leaves Casablanca really feeling he had done well. He'd gotten what he wanted, which was an okay for a Mediterranean campaign in 1943. He has no other great successes in the conferences that come after that.
One of the reasons, you mentioned it a few minutes ago, that not just the Americans were wanting the invasion of France, but it was clearly the only way that the two Western allies could make Marshal Stalin happy. And he pressed them vigorously to, like, the trucks and the tanks and the money and the gas and all that. That's all wonderful. We're losing. What's the latest? Hell, the estimate for the Russian losses on the Eastern Front seems like it goes up every day, including October 4th, 2024. You're talking plus civilians, 15, 20, 30 million. I think Stalin understands the losses they're taking, but Roosevelt also understands the losses they're taking and feels some sort of obligation, I would say, and it comes through in your book. Look, we've got to get into this war. And Sicily ain't it.
Roosevelt is thinking about the post-war. And then a lot of Roosevelt, what he's thinking is, we have to find a way to keep the wartime alliance together. So we've got to keep the United States with the Soviet Union, with the British and the Chinese. That's why he uses that phrase, the four policemen. And he's serious about it in the sense that he believes that will be the structure that will keep the peace of the world going forward. He's not wildly clear on how that structure is going to work, but he really believes it's important that the leaderships of those four countries get along. And he knows Stalin, by the way, Stalin wants an invasion in 1942. Stalin would the US and the UK to basically throw troops into France whenever they can.
And then
Roosevelt says, we can't do that, but we got to do it by 1944, not least because to show Stalin we're serious.
Forgive me, Professor O'Brien, but weren't there plans to like land in France in 1942 or early 1943? I forget the name of the operation.
There was a plan that if the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. So it wasn't like a considered, let's do this. It was, if the Soviet Union looks on the verge of collapse, do we just make a rush into France to try and draw off as many troops as possible? But Roosevelt didn't want to do that. Roosevelt wants to do Torch in 1942. He wants to do North Africa. So that's not his ideal plan. And he's very happy they don't have to do it because he would prefer not to.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Phillips O'Brien. We're discussing his book, The Strategists: Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt, Mussolini, and Hitler. How war made them and how they made war. I'm going to skip over Roosevelt and come to him in a little bit. But Stalin, your recounting of Stalin's early life as it goes into the war, the First World War, and then the Russian Revolution, it's a miracle he was around in some ways. Like, how is this guy still alive? And yet he really does. And this happens in other books too. There's high praise in your book and others of Stalin's intelligence and his ability to figure things out, and obviously his staying power. And of course, he's probably the most murderous person who ever lived. I guess him and Mao would be 1 and 2, maybe. How does Stalin get from being a poor seminary student, imprisoned revolutionary, to General Secretary and Generalissimo of the Soviet Union? It's an astounding journey.
The Russian Revolution is only possible because of the First World War, and it's the only thing that could have propelled Stalin to the position. And the way that the First World War is the only thing that could have propelled Adolf Hitler to power. Without the First World War, Hitler's a minor painter on the streets of Munich. And what the First World War does, it takes Stalin, who's a bit of a gangster and a terrorist, and ends up making him into this very important political leader. There's two things that do it. One is that the Tsarist state doesn't shoot its prisoners. If Stalin had run the Tsarist state, Stalin would never have been around in 1914. Okay.
That's so true.
Yeah, the Tsarist state instead tends to exile them. So they exile Stalin really to a deeply unpleasant place, but it keeps him alive. So when the war breaks out, he's just in the middle of nowhere. He is in northern Siberia. In this place which it takes weeks on a sled to reach it in the winter. It's just an inaccessible part of Siberia. But that also protects him because he's never in the Tsarist army. He can't be forced into the army because he's living in the remote part of Siberia. And then he's able to stay there until the Russian Revolution breaks out. And then the Russian Revolution just leads to chaos, and there's no organization. There's nothing to stop him. So he's able to get to St. Petersburg in the chaos of the revolution. And only in that chaos can a small group of fanatics like the Bolsheviks take power. It really is. You think of a small terrorist group, right? And a small terrorist group is not normally going to rise to political power. But they can rise to political power in 1917-18 because the Tsarist state is so weak. And the Tsarist state collapses, the new provisional government's weak, and what the Bolsheviks have, and Stalin's with them, is absolute ruthlessness. They are successful practitioners of violence. That's how they had made themselves. And they're able to use violence to take advantage of this very special time in history, really unusual time in history, to grab control over the Russian state. And what they can do is they're basically more ruthless than anyone else. They're never the majority, even though the Bolshevik means majority. It's a joke because they're never the majority, but they're always actually a minority, even on the left in the socialist parties. But they're able to use their ruthlessness and ability not to be cowed to take control first over St. Petersburg and then over all of Russia. It's quite an extraordinary story. So this very small group, of which Stalin is a key member, Stalin had been a well-known Bolshevik in Bolshevik circles, so he is able to use the Russian Revolution to propel himself into power. And by the way, he's one of the few people who's trusted by Lenin. And I think there's sometimes people think, oh, Lenin didn't like Stalin, and maybe they fell out right before Lenin died. But in 1917-18, Lenin really trusts Stalin. He's one of those. Stalin is one of the few people Lenin really trusts to carry information, to have important tasks. He gives Stalin quite important military commands as a sign of his trustworthiness. So that's another important part of Stalin rising to power, is he has Lenin's trust at this period, and he uses it ruthlessly to push himself forward.
But Stalin turns out in the war to be, I love your description, and if you want to take a minute and go through it, of Stalin's reaction when he realizes that the German invasion is not the hoax. He had so many warnings it was coming. He said Hitler would never do it. He had deserters crossing over into Soviet lines from the German army saying we're attacking in 6 hours. I think he was killed by the Soviets. What was it about Stalin's background and his experiences, ruthlessness, that allowed him to survive the initial reaction and the devastating defeats when Germany invades the Soviet Union in June of 41?
If we go back to his Russian Revolution, Russian Civil War experiences, what he learns from that is you can actually screw up, but if you win in the end, you can just write history the way you want. He's not actually a terribly successful military commander. He has a command in Tsaritsyn, which turns into Stalingrad. He has commands in the Russian-Polish War, the Soviet-Polish War, and none of them do his commands do terribly well. In many cases, they do very poorly. But what happens is he ends up on the winning side. And because he ends up on the winning side, he's able, in many ways, to surmount that and write history the way he wants. So he's very, in that sense, he ultimately is practical when it comes to winning. He knows he has to win. Right? Now, what he does is he uses that in June 1941 to recover from the blow. What Stalin thinks he's been cleverer than anybody from 1939 to 1941. Because what he thinks is, a clever Joe, what I've done is I signed the Nazi-Soviet pact, and that meant that the Germans are going to fight the British and the French, and these capitalist powers are going to absolutely devastate themselves. And then once they're exhausted, I will be able to move in and take over, and I will come in a very strong position. So he thinks he has actually set things up perfectly for him. Yeah. And even in early 1941, he thinks if Britain is fighting Germany, they're going to have to fight first. I can prepare, I can get ready, because the capitalist powers are fighting. And so when people start saying, I think Hitler's getting ready to attack, I don't think he can personally admit it, because he doesn't want to admit at this point he's wrong. It's very difficult for Stalin to admit he's wrong if he doesn't have real concrete evidence that he is, because he is a dictator in a way that nobody has been a dictator. He can just control anything in his country. Hitler is not even a dictator, I would argue, in the way that Stalin is, in terms of the absolute control of all elements of the state. And so when he gets these reports of what the Germans are doing, the Germans are getting ready to invade, he simply doesn't want to admit that, because it admit that he had screwed up. He didn't understand what he was doing. So it must be, Hitler won't do that to him, because Hitler, according to his plan, Hitler shouldn't do it to him. That was really what he thought. And then when the invasion occurs in June 1941, it is temporarily catastrophic for Stalin. Because everything he had been telling everyone is shown to be false. Just wrong. He was wrong. And the German army is now in the Soviet Union. It's streaking through the Western Soviet Union, making very fast advances, destroying his armed forces. And he has to then wrestle with the fact that he had failed. Now, this gives him two things. On the one hand, he pivots very quickly to his practical side. I've got to win. It doesn't matter. He won't say out loud he screwed up, but he screwed up. But it doesn't matter. Now I've got to win. Then I can go have all these movies made about how I was a strategic genius the whole time, which he does do. So what he does at that point is he reaches out very effectively to the United States and Britain. Before, he had been very critical of them. He'd been almost a proto-ally of Hitler. Now he loves the United States and the United Kingdom and really wants to fight with them. And can they give him lots of aid? And they do. The United States and the United Kingdom start providing him with a great deal of aid. So he gets over any qualms he had about working with Americans and British overnight. Just that's it. Okay, we will get along. And he also realizes, I think this is an interesting thing about him. If he had been second or third in command to a leader who screwed up as badly as he did, he would have taken that leader out and shot him. He would have used that as the opportunity to get rid of the leader and make himself leader. Right. But he had so emasculated all the other Soviet leaders, they couldn't function without him. So he thinks they're going to come and arrest him in 1941 for really having screwed up so badly. But actually, they come to him in 1941 and go, Joseph, what do? We can't do anything without you. You have to tell us what to do.
It's shocking.
And that provides him, I think, in a certain way, with the ability to trust those people for the rest of the war. Because they had an opportunity to kill him. What he would have done, they had an opportunity to overthrow him, which he probably would have done were he in their situation, but they can't do it. So it allows him to trust enough. He's not a trustworthy person. He doesn't trust a lot of people, but at least to realize these people are not going to overthrow him. And it allows him to work with the United States and the United Kingdom. And that becomes his very practical side taking over at that time.
As we get to later on in the war and all the arguments, debates, some heated, some not, about where to fight, against whom, which materials to use. How much did Franklin Roosevelt, as the war starts to enter its last few years, emerge as the chief strategist for the Allies? In other words, I've got all the candy and I'll decide what we're going to do. That's A. B, please take a few minutes and talk about Roosevelt's insistence on unconditional surrender, because that was, to me, that was directly related to the fact that it did not exist in World War I. Then Germany could say we were never really beaten. He didn't want the Germans or the Japanese to feel, oh, we could have won, but.
Yeah. The unconditional one is fascinating. I mean, I'll go back to the First World War and talk about the second after I talk about unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender is not anything that he fully works out before he brings it into existence. That it really comes out of the Casablanca Conference. This idea, okay, we're going to have unconditional surrender of Germany and Japan. But he hadn't spent a lot of time working out what that meant going into the war, or indeed even before going to Casablanca. So I'm not quite sure why it gets the press it gets is because he makes it an issue at Casablanca. And why I think he wants it is he really wants to settle the war. He wants this war not to be like the first one. He doesn't want it to be what he thinks a false peace, which leads to another world war. He wants to mean that this will end major wars for a long period. And he only believes you can crush German power. Germany's the most powerful state to him, that there's the threat. You can only crush Germany if, in a sense, you can do whatever you want to it. There can be no negotiations. There can be no attempt by Germany to retain some of its power. So that's, I think, why it comes about in his mind. It's not always the best decision that he makes. In some ways, it stiffens German resolve. and the German people fight longer than they would have. But it is something that he brings to the table in Casablanca, and therefore he does remain quite devoted to it. And I think it's because he does view it as, okay, this is the way to end Germany as a threat to the United States. Now, in terms of Roosevelt running he runs the candy shop. Roosevelt is in an extraordinarily powerful position because he is providing a huge amount of aid to both of his allies. Both the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union get huge amount of U.S. goods to keep fighting. Both of them would have absolutely struggled to fight without the U.S. The Soviet Union couldn't have built an aircraft because they don't have any aluminum. They're getting huge amounts of aluminum from the United States. They would have had a much greater time moving their army, more difficult time. The British, on the other hand, received even more aid to their economy to keep themselves going. So the British are receiving massive aid, whereas the U.S. is really taking aid from no one. So the U.S. is not only building its own armed forces up, but it's providing huge aid to its allies, and that makes Roosevelt very powerful. And Stalin, by the way, recognizes that. He treats Roosevelt totally differently than he treats Churchill. With Churchill, he can be a bit tough, a bit mean, a bit rough, and also a bit conspiratorial. They can have a drink and carve up different parts of Europe. With Roosevelt, at least until Yalta, he's very respectful.
Stalin and Roosevelt are both anti-imperialists. Roosevelt, perhaps even more so than Stalin. There's Russian-British antagonism going back centuries. And now, for once, it's the Soviets, the Russians, who are the ascending power. Clearly, he viewed United Kingdom and Churchill as fading. But you're right about some of the nastiness between them. But going back to unconditional surrender, because I wanted to ask you about this too, it wasn't only the Axis powers who looked askance at that. Okay, then we're just going to fight to the end. Many of Roosevelt's own advisors found that to be an error.
Yeah, they thought it was going too far. Yeah, that was because it was very typical of Roosevelt at times, who could just do things that were impulsive because he thought he had huge confidence in himself. By the way, they all did. You don't become a leader in a wartime of a major power if you're not a very self-confident personality. And Roosevelt was enormously confident in his own abilities. And that led him at times to do things a bit on the whim. I would say he does that with the Morgenthau Plan in September of 1944, where he all of a sudden adopts the Morgenthau Plan as the U.S. plan, even though a lot of people in his government were not wild about it. And I think that's
Stimson, especially.
Yeah, Stimson's, but other people, Leahy's not, the military people aren't wild about it. So there's a lot of people, but I think unconditional surrender is a bit like that. He decides to make it an issue, and it is not a consensus among his government, but ultimately, Franklin Roosevelt doesn't care what other people think. If he believes something very strongly, he really believes his own person is very important to the success of the end of the war and the future. And he is going to do what he thinks is best.
We have a few minutes left with Phillips O'Brien. He is the author of a phenomenal book on World War II and its leadership. The Strategists: Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt, Mussolini, and Hitler. How war made them and how they made war. Now, I don't want to be a jingoistic Yank. I try my hardest, even though I was just in Normandy a few months ago to see that fabulous place. But as a scholar of the war, sometimes, let me ask it this way. Is it almost impossible to overstate the role American production, industrial production played in the ultimate outcome of World War II? You read the statistics and they're just mind-blowing. One of my favorite quotes about the United States is from Sir Edward Grey, who was a British politician. He was actually foreign secretary when World War I started. Yep. And his quote, I forget who he said it to. He may have said it to Churchill, but to whomever he said it, he said, "The United States is like a gigantic boiler. Once lit, there's no limit to the amount of heat it can produce." That came true in World War II.
The United States, by the end of the Second World War, is half the world's economy. Half. It's not only, it's bigger than all of Europe together. It's bigger than all of Europe together, plus Japan and China. It is half the world's production is being done by the United States. And that is probably historically unprecedented. I can't think of another time when one country, even one empire, would have been half the world's production. I don't know if the Roman Empire would have ever reached that stage, or China. So I think that, and because it also has this industrial ability to expand. It has factories that aren't being attacked by the air. It can just produce on the kind of scale that none of the other powers can. And I think that is ultimately, I have a very functional view of war. People say, I don't believe war is won by bravery. I don't believe they're won by. There's brave soldiers, there's cowards on both sides. If I was going to say to you, who are the bravest soldiers of the Second World War? I'd have to say, in my mind, the Japanese who would just die and kill themselves. That's bravery. Yeah. It's suicidal bravery, but it's bravery. American soldiers wouldn't do that. They wouldn't, on the whole, just lay or fight to the death all the time and know they were going to go into campaign and die. The Japanese would regularly go into a campaign and know they were going to die. And I don't know if an American or British army would have done that.
Hence the atomic bomb.
Yep. Hence the ability. You have to really let them know they can't. They have to be defeated. But what Roosevelt does is he views war from the point of view of machines and economics and controlling supply lines. He very much goes back to the Admiral Mahan. He's a real believer in the theories of Admiral Mahan and naval power, which if you can control the world's oceans and the supply of goods, you will win a war. People get obsessed about land armies. But Roosevelt, by the way, never liked the land war. And when he was in the First World War, he goes to France in 1918, and he hates the land war. He hates the smell. Just to him, it stinks. It's muddy. It's dirty. It's bloody. He wants as little to do with the land war as at all possible. It's just not something that engages him. He believes the war will be won by production and the control of the world economy. Give us more stuff, we'll make more stuff, and Germany and Japan ultimately will be crushed to death. That's his view of war. We'll crush them to death with aircraft carriers, with naval power, and then eventually in the end with the army. And the U.S. fights that kind of war. He basically says, okay, we are going to make more than anyone else can imagine. And they do. It takes a little longer to do than he thinks. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is that U.S. production actually, people sometimes think the U.S. throughout the war can make whatever it wants. But actually in 1942, it falls far below production targets. It's really only 43, 44 that they're just really churning out the stuff. And at that point, the U.S. puts together an unstoppable military machine.
It's his belief, Roosevelt's belief in force multipliers is what sets him apart to me. And it comes through in your book, so I don't want to take credit for your idea, God forbid. But it comes through in your book and in other books. He is a believer in, we don't need the best tank, but we need 5,000 of the next best tanks.
Yep.
And that'll be good enough.
Well, he does believe we need the best aircraft and best naval vessels.
Yes, sir.
See, I would say that's an interesting thing. The land war to him, okay, we'll build huge numbers of tanks and a huge number of artillery pieces, and we will win. But we need to have dominance of air and sea power. That has to happen. So we do need to build the best aircraft, and we do have to build the best naval vessels. He does absolutely believe that. And that's where the U.S. invests. The most expensive weapons program of the entire war for any power is not the atom bomb. People think it's the atom bomb.
B-29.
It's the B-29 bomber.
Yeah. That's unbelievable to me. I read that several years ago. I forget in which book, maybe Hanson's book, and I was astounded.
That was in my book, How the War Was Won, which that's actually 2015, How the War Was Won, Air, Sea Power, and Allied Victory. And breakdown by weapon systems. Nothing comes close to the B-29. It's basically, they say, okay, we need a very long-range bomber. It's actually not called the B-29 program. It's called the Very Long-Range Bomber. And by the way, that's why they build there's no B-30, no B-31, because they were all part of that. And the B-29 is the design they choose. There's also a B-28 and all of that. Right. So they build a lot of different prototypes of the long-range bomber. It's so important to them But the B-29 is the one they choose, and that's a revolutionary aircraft for the time. But that just costs. That is unlike any other weapon system in the war.
I'm going to snag that book. So you just sold a book. You may not have known it, but you just sold a book.
It's the one that got me in a lot of trouble because it argues the Eastern Front's not that important.
Oh, then
basically, Robert, if you look at the production of the Second World War, the Second World War. I'm sorry, we're on the same time. But this would be really interesting to get your view. If I had to say to you, German economy in 1943, half of the German economy is making tanks and aircraft. So 50% of German war production is tanks and aircraft, and the other 50% is everything else. It's artillery pieces, it's submarines, it's small arms, it's flak. Everything is the other half. But half of it alone is tanks and aircraft. What do you think that would be in terms of breakdown? What percentage of that 50 would be tanks and what percentage of that 50 would be aircraft?
I don't know.
Take a guess. You know the Second World War as much as anyone. What would it be? What would your gut tell you? 25-25?
No.
49-1? What would it be?
Hitler's a land soldier, so I'm going to guess 35-15 tanks to planes.
43% aircraft, 7% tanks.
So
the
I'm
land war
wrong.
is a tiny part of German production. They're having to build aircraft too because the air war is taking over the war. The German economy, if you put arming the aircraft, that's just building the aircraft. If you put arming the aircraft, you have over 50% of German production every year is aircraft. You add anti-air into that, you're getting close to 60%. The Germans are fighting an air war. That's what their economy is doing. And it gets increasingly so as the bombing kicks off in 1943. Hitler's desperate to fight this. The land war on the Eastern Front gets small amounts of German production. People just get that wrong. It's a small theater in terms of production. It's a large theater in terms of infantry. So that's where the Germans are sending their infantry, is to the Eastern Front. But it is not where they're sending their war production.
You actually led me into this question, and I want to be mindful of your time. Behind you is a copy of Why the Allies Won by Richard Overy.
Richard Overy, yeah.
Who I think is brilliant. And man, talk about somebody I'd like to talk to for sure.
Richard and I disagree a bit on this issue.
That's why it led right to it. So I forget, and correct me please if I'm wrong, but the strategic bombing campaign, especially in Germany. So your book's mostly about the European war, so let's leave the firebombing and Mr. Congeniality, Curtis LeMay, to another discussion. The strategic bombing of Germany, if I was to paper in your class and call it overrated, what grade would I get?
You have to prove it, and you can't prove that through construction. The Germans are spending more equipment defending against the strategic bombing of Germany than they're spending on the Eastern Front.
Right.
So what it doesn't do, the strategic bombing fails by its claims, because what it says it's going to do is break the German economy. It doesn't do that. But what it does do is take and destroy more German production than the land war. Why are there no German fighters on the Eastern Front from the second half of 1943 onwards? Because they're all over Germany. That's where the German war economy is fighting. So what it does do is it destroys production more than any other part. And I don't think people have given it the credit for that, for doing that. And then in How the War Was Won, I have a chapter on 43, and I call it the war-winning failure. To look at strategic bombing, not for what they said it was going to do, but for what it actually does.
Whose strategic vision of the war, of the 5 people you profile in your book, whose strategic vision most matches the ultimate winning strategy?
Well, Roosevelt would have, but he died. The interesting thing about Roosevelt is so much of it was based on what he would then do when the war was over. So he wins the war basically along his lines, or mostly along his lines, but we don't know what he would have done after the war to try to bring his post-war vision into the future. So Roosevelt very much plays the dominant role in winning the war, I would say, but doesn't get the post-war world, partly because he dies. Stalin ends up with a lot of what he wants, but of course I argue in the end of the book, Stalin is a bit overrated because actually he sets up the conditions of Soviet failure a few decades later. That he could have had a much more positive relationship with the United States.
Right.
But he can't understand that. All of a sudden, his practical mind goes away because he's won the war, and now he's back to being the ideological thug. So Stalin, I think, we don't understand that Stalin actually takes what could have been a really advantageous position for the Soviet Union and turns it into a Cold War with the U.S., which he's bound to lose, and it does lose.
Roosevelt dies in 45. Hitler dies in 45. Mussolini dies in 45.
Yep.
Stalin, I think, dies in 53.
Yeah, Stalin has a heart attack in 45.
In which he could have lived, except for the fact they were too scared to knock on the door and wake him up. And Churchill lives until 1965.
Churchill has the Constitution. I would love to have Churchill's Constitution. I do not know how he does it. I have two glasses of wine now, and I have a hangover that would basically, causes me to moan in pain. And he could just drink a bottle of champagne and smoke a few cigars every day and fine.
It's incredible. He lives to be
get on with it. So,
he lives to be 90. And he famously loses election in July of 45 at the Potsdam Conference. His party gets absolutely crushed.
Yep.
But yet, because of his contributions to the Cold War, to me, his reputation, he was an author, he helped write his own history, but he just seems to get so many things right.
He gets two things in particular. One, he gets the credit for continuing to fight in 1940. And I don't think we can underrate the importance in his reputation of things like the Battle of Britain and continuing to fight once France falls. And so he has that moment where Britain has lost its biggest ally, France, and yet he continues on, and he continues on quite successfully to the moment of 1940. And even if in some ways he fails to have his grand strategy implemented afterwards, he's forced into D-Day, he's forced to do things he doesn't like. The fact that he has this moment in 1940 cements his historical reputation, I think, without a doubt. When he gives the single most important speech of the Second World War, never has so much been owed by so many to so few. How many, or we will never surrender. I don't think that he gives two of the greatest speeches of the war. No one else's would be remembered. You can't really remember much of a Roosevelt speech during the war. There's the Day of Infamy speech after Pearl Harbor, but then you don't really remember much, whereas Churchill has those moments. But then you say he becomes the Cold War statesman as well. And he comes up with the Iron Curtain speech. So he does have these moments in history that are impossible to top.
We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Professor O'Brien, are you ready?
Yeah.
You're going to get a bonus question because since we're talking about strategy and decision making. But first one, what was your first job?
Paid or unpaid? Paid. I worked in a warehouse when I was just before 16 as a janitor.
Where?
In Worcester, in Woburn, Mass, for the Charette Company.
What was your first concert?
I remember my parents would take me to the symphony when I was a little boy. I remember going to the Boston Symphony. I'm from Boston. So
when's the first concert you paid for?
James Taylor in the Harvard Stadium. And don't ask me the year. It would have been sometime in the 70s. So.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Wow. This is something which has really troubled me. My favorite book up until a few years ago was The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov. And I would read that every year. And then I found out he was violently anti-Ukrainian. And I've been unable to read it in the same way since. So up until a few years ago, certainly Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, I think, is the greatest novel. It's the greatest novel for understanding Stalinist Russia, because it's actually a surrealist novel set in Stalinist Russia, Stalinist Soviet Union. So I would have said that. I'll probably stick with that, but I have to say I don't view it in the same light I used to.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I would choose a few hundred years from now when hopefully someone comes up with faster than light travel.
We'll give you a mulligan on that one.
Yeah. It would be some what would have been the coolest thing to see? I think it would have been something in Pericles' speech in Athens. Would have been really cool. Plus, it would have been great to live in Athens at that time. So I think I would have liked to have seen, did Pericles actually give this great speech that Thucydides said he gave?
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record to chat about anything you want, whom would you choose?
Living today. Whew. I would have to say probably someone from technology. Politicians are a bit boring to me right now. So it might be Bill Gates or Sam Altman or something who understand where technological developments are going.
Last question. You are the president of the United States.
Yeah.
Do you drop the bombs on Japan?
I personally would have dropped the bomb, but not on a city.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategists, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister, who landed in North Africa in November of 42. Sure. Our guest today, Phillips Payson O'Brien, the strategist, Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt, Mussolini, and Hitler, how war made them and how they made war. Professor O'Brien, thank you so much, not only for writing the book, which is a marvelous read, but for your time today coming on the podcast. I hope you had fun.
I did very much, Robert. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.